You see, most people have no idea how the Bible came to be at all. We in the West tend to imagine it as something that simply fell from heaven, already bound and titled. But the truth is far more curious. It was the Church, yes, the early Catholic tradition, that not only preserved the text, but also decided which ones would be included. The writings we now call the New Testament were penned by people within that movement, and they also adopted older Hebrew scriptures, even though at the time of Jesus the Jewish canon was still unsettled. In fact, the Jewish community didn't finalize what we now call the Old Testament until around 100 AD, during a council at a place called Jamnia. They settled on what belonged, and those texts were eventually compiled into what scholars refer to as the Masoretic text, though the oldest complete copy we possess dates from many centuries later. As for the New Testament, its canon wasn't firmly established until 382 AD, under the auspices of Pope Damasus at the Council of Rome. It was there the Church said, in essence, "Here are the scriptures given to you by our authority and by the living tradition that has flowed through us from the beginning, moved, as we believe, by the Spirit of God." So whether you like it or not, historically speaking, you receive the Bible because the Church said, this is it. And the Church also claims the right to interpret what it means, again, as a community guided by the same Spirit. Now, you can accept that or disregard it. After all, anyone can write a book and claim these words were revealed to me by the divine. You're free to believe that or not. The Hindus hold that the Vedas were spoken by the gods. Muslims are certain the Quran is the direct word of Allah. Buddhists too have their sutras, which they revere not as the word of a god, but as timeless expressions of awakened wisdom. If we are going to argue about this, as to which version of the truth is the correct one, we will always end up in an argument in which the judge and the advocate are the same person. And you wouldn't want that if you were brought into a court of law, would you? Because if I say that, well, thinking it all over, I find that Jesus Christ is the greatest being who ever came onto this earth. By what standards do I judge? There is nobody impartial who can decide between all the religions, because more or less everybody has been in one way or another influenced by one of them. I won't deny anybody's right to hold these opinions. You may indeed believe that the Bible is literally true, and that it was actually dictated by God to Moses and the prophets and the apostles. And that may be your opinion, and you are at liberty to hold it. I don't agree with you. I do believe, on the other hand, that there is a sense in which the Bible is divinely inspired. Divine inspiration is a wisdom which it's very difficult to put into words, like mystical experience. That's divine inspiration. And a person who writes out of that experience could be said to be divinely inspired. But since inspiration always comes through a human vehicle, it is liable to be distorted by that vehicle. Now, so therefore, everybody who receives divine inspiration will express it within the limits of what language he knows. I mean language in the sense of what sort of terms are available to you. What kind of religion were you brought up with? And you had a mystical experience of the type where you suddenly discover that you are one with God. Then you're allowable to get up and say, I'm Jesus Christ. And lots of people do. Well, the culture that we live in just can't allow that. There were only one Jesus Christ, and you don't look like you were Jesus Christ coming back again. Because it's said in the scriptures that when he comes back, there will be no doubt about it. He'll appear in the heavens with legions of angels, and you're not doing that. You're just old Joe does that we knew years ago. Now you say you're Jesus Christ? Well, he says that when Jesus Christ said he was God, nobody believed him, and you don't believe again. You know, you can't answer that argument. He says it that way because he is trying to express what happened to him in terms of a religious language which is circumscribed by the Holy Bible. He's never read the Upanishads. He's never read the Diamond Sutra. He's never read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, of the Aing or the Leza. But if he had read the Upanishads, he would have had no difficulty, because it says in the Upanishads, we are all incarnations of God. Only they don't mean by the word God. In fact, they don't use that word. They use Brahman. Brahman is not the creator of the world, but the actor of the world in which the Brahman plays a role. Now, my assumption, my opinion is that Jesus of Nazareth was a human being who early in life had a colossal experience of what we call cosmic consciousness. It can hit anyone, anytime, like falling in love. And when it hits you, you know it. That there comes this overwhelming conviction that you have mistaken your identity. What I thought was just old Alan Watts was only completely superficial. That I am an expression of an eternal something or other. And that I suddenly understand why, exactly why, everything is the way it is. It's perfectly clear. Furthermore, I feel no longer any boundary between what I do and what happens to me. I feel that everything that's going on is my doing, just as my breathing is. Is your breathing voluntary or involuntary? Do you do it, or does it happen to you? So you can feel it both ways. But you feel everything like breathing. There is no longer any separate you. There is just this great happening going on. So you can very well understand how people to whom this happens feel genuinely inspired, because very often there goes along with it an extremely warm feeling. You see, when you look into the eyes of others and truly see, you recognize the divine gazing back, each one playing their part in this immense cosmic performance. The disciples didn't entirely grasp this. They were dazzled by the miracles, caught up in the display. They revered Jesus, much like followers often do with their spiritual teachers. And so the Christians said, all right, Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of God, but let it end there, no one else. What followed was that Jesus became the exception, lifted up onto a pedestal. And those who came later, who experienced the same truth and spoke of it during the time the church held power, were almost always punished for it. Giordano Bruno was burned alive. John Scotus Eriugena was cast out. Meister Eckhart's teachings were condemned. And you see what that means. To elevate Jesus like that is to cut off the message before it begins. Gospel, after all, means good news. And I struggle to find the good news in the way the gospel is usually handed down. It presents the revelation of God in the person of Jesus and tells us to follow his path, except he had the advantage of knowing he was the divine Son, of having miraculous powers, of being quite certain he could not be destroyed and would rise again. Yet we are asked to bear our own crosses and walk as he did, without any of that assurance. The tradition, Catholic, Protestant, and fundamentalist alike, gives us a Jesus who is a strange figure, born of a virgin, fully aware of his divine origin, able to perform wonders and untouchable by death. And we are meant to emulate him, though we have none of that clarity ourselves. So it becomes, in truth, a religion of the impossible. Christianity turned guilt into a virtue. You can never quite match up. You are always falling short. And the more aware you are of that gap between Christ and yourself, the more virtuous you are made to feel. But the true good news was never that Jesus alone was the Son of God. It was that he came to awaken everyone to the fact that you are too. I feel then, you see, that it's enormously important that churches stop being talking shops. They become centers of contemplation. What is contemplation? It's what you do in the temple. You don't come to the temple to chatter, but to be still and know that I am God. Most study of comparative religions that goes on in theological schools has historically been missionary-oriented, to find out the weird ideas of the prospects, so as to be able to undermine them. Because you see, if you know in the first place that you have the true religion, there really is no point in studying any other one. And you can very quickly find reasons for showing them to be inferior, because that was a foregone conclusion. They had to be. And therefore, all arguments about the respective merits of various religions, especially where Christianity is involved, and often where Judaism is involved, and sometimes Islam too, all of which are essentially imperialistic religions. In all such discussions, the judge and the advocate are usually the same person. Because if, for example, you get into discussions as to whether Buddha was a more profound and spiritual character than Jesus Christ, you arrive at your decision on the basis of a scale of values, which is, of course, Christian. And in this sense, the judge and the advocate are the same. And I really do marvel at this Christian imperialism, because it prevails even among theological liberal. And it reaches its final absurdity in religionless Christianity, the doctrine that there is no God and Jesus Christ is his only Son. Because, you see, there's some anxiety here, that even though we don't believe in God anymore, somehow we've still got to be Christians. And obviously because we have a very curious organization which must be understood, the inner meaning of the church as it works, in fact. A society of the saved, you see, necessarily requires outside it a society of the not saved. Because if there is not that contrast, you don't know that you belong to the in-group. And in this way, all social groups with claims to some kind of special status must necessarily create aliens and foreigners. And St. Thomas Aquinas let the cat out of the bag one day, when he said that the saints in heaven would occasionally appear over the battlements into hell and praise God for the just punishment visited upon evildoers. Now, as you know, I'm not being very fair and very kind to modern theology. But there is this strange persistence of insisting that our group is the best group. And I feel that there is in there something peculiarly irreligious. And furthermore, it exhibits a very strange lack of faith, because I believe that there is a strong distinction between faith on the one hand and belief on the other, that belief is, as a matter of fact, quite contrary to faith. Because belief is really wishing. It's from the Anglo-Saxon root leaf, to wish. And belief, stated, say, in the Creed, is a fervent hope that the universe will turn out to be thus and so. And in this sense, therefore, belief precludes the possibility of faith, because faith is openness to truth, to reality, whatever it may turn out to be. I want to know the truth. That is the attitude of faith. And therefore, to use ideas about the universe and about God as something to hang on to in the spirit of Rock of Ages cleft for me. You know, hymn imagery is full of rocks. A mighty fortress is our God. In vain the surgery's angry shark, in vain the drifting sand, unharmed upon the eternal rock, the eternal cities dance. And there's something very rigid about a rock. And we are finding our rock getting rather worn out in an age where it becomes more and more obvious that our world is a floating world. It's a world floating in space, where all positions are relative, and any point may be regarded as the center. A world which doesn't float on anything, and therefore the religious attitude appropriate to our time is not one of clinging to rocks, but of learning to swim. And you know that if you get in the water and you have nothing to hold on to, and you try to behave as you would on dry land, you will drown. But if, on the other hand, you trust yourself to the water and let go, you will float. And this is exactly the situation of faith. This is surely all implied in the New Testament, When, for example, Jesus began to foretell his own death, his disciples were very disturbed, because it is written in our law that the Messiah does not die. And he replied, "Unless a grain of corn fall into the ground and die, it remains isolated and brings forth no fruit, or of it. But if it die, it brings forth much fruit." And on another occasion he said to the disciples, "It is expedient for you that I go away. For if I go not away, the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit, cannot come to you." But we have reversed all this. Jesus, to me, was one of those rare and remarkable individuals who had a particular kind of spiritual experience, which, in terms of Hebrew theology, he found most difficult to express without blasphemy. I and the Father are one. In other words, I am God. And that is something, of course, if you are a Hindu, that is a rather natural statement to make. You see, in our culture, which has Hebrew theology in its background, anyone who says, I am God, is either blasphemous or insane. Because our image of God, and the image, don't forget, has far more emotional power than any amount of theology and abstraction. It is our Father which really influences us as a conception of God. Not necessarily being or thelex, decontaminated name for God, the ground of being, or Professor Northrup's undifferentiated aesthetic continuum. These aren't very moving, even though subtle theologians prefer this kind of thing, and will tell us that when we call God the Father, we don't have to believe literally that there is a cosmic male parent, and still less that he has a white beard and sits on a golden throne above the stars. Nobody, no serious theologian, ever believed in such a God. But nevertheless, the imagery affects us, because the image of the monotheistic God of the West is political. The title, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, is the title of the emperors of ancient Persia. The image of God is based on the pharaohs, the great rulers of the Chaldeans, and the kings of Persia. And so this is the political governor and Lord of the universe who keeps order and who rules it from, metaphorically speaking, above. So anyone who would say, I am God, is therefore implying that he's in charge of everything, that he knows all about it, and therefore everybody else ought to bow down and worship him. But in India, if you say, I am God, they say, congratulations, at last you found out, because the image is quite different. See, our image of the world is that the world is a construct. And it's very natural for a child to say to its mother, how was I made? As if, you know, you were somehow put together. But that takes us back to the image in Genesis, where God forms Adam as a figure of clay. And then he breathes the breath of life into its nostrils, and it becomes alive. Here lies the basic assumption, one that underpins much of Western thought, even modern science, that everything has been constructed, and that someone knows how it was done, and that if you look carefully enough you can figure it out, because behind the whole show there must be a designer. You might call this the ceramic model of existence, because it rests on the idea that there are two essential things. One is the material, and the other is the form. Matter, like clay, is assumed to be unintelligent on its own. It doesn't think, it doesn't know, it just sits there. And so, for that matter to become structured, to take on shape and meaning, there has to be some kind of outside intelligence that gives it form. And with this deeply lodged in our common sense, it becomes very hard to question whether this picture reflects reality at all. Yet, in fact, the whole idea of inert substance has disappeared from modern physics, which now studies nature in terms of pattern, of structure, not stuff. But if you turn to the Hindu view of things, and I'm referring here to mythology, to the everyday imagery people grow up with, just as I'm speaking of the common imagery in the West, not the refined theology, you'll find something quite different. The Hindu conception is that the universe is not made, it is performed. It is a drama. And so Within every face, whether it appears as a person, an animal, a tree, or even a stone, there is the presence, or perhaps the absence, of the central self, the Atman, which is Brahman. That is the final reality, which cannot be described, because whatever is truly at the center of all things can never be turned into an object of knowledge. You cannot bite your own teeth. You cannot lift yourself by your own bootstraps. It is what is. It is the ground. And that is what you are.